Hello, this is another recording for the Suffolk Jungian Circle, and as with all of these recordings, if anybody who's not a member of the circle is nonetheless interested in the subject matter, by all means leave a comment, and if you'd like to take part in the monthly discussion, the final Wednesday of the month, 7:30 in the evening, then I can, if you leave a message, I can send you the Teams link to take part. It's all free. So the theme for the April discussion is the ideas and theories of John Rowan. Rowan wasn't a full-on Jungian, but he did draw upon a lot of Jungian concepts. He wrote extensively about archetypes, for example, particularly in relation to the male psyche, and was part of the sort of men's spiritual growth movement that grew from about the 1970s onwards and sort of developed as the decades went on. Similar to the Iron John thing with Robert Bly, although Rowan wasn't particularly keen on Robert Bly's approach to the whole Iron John thing. He felt it was missing a few key issues, but broadly speaking, it was within that era of those sorts of men's groups developing. And some of them, of course, do still exist. So we'll talk about John Rowan a little bit. We'll also branch out to talk about Robert Assagioli, who inspired a lot of Rowan's ideas, particularly around subpersonality thesis. Assagioli got there first in developing the idea of these subpersonalities, but John Rowan expanded upon and extended the arguments around subpersonalities, and that's going to be the main focus of what I'm going to witter about. So the initial idea from Assagioli was that every single person, as a healthy, functioning, well-adjusted individual, has these sorts of subsets of identities that exist within the psyche. They are clusters of social scripts, to use an idea from Bartlett and various other people who've commented on schema, but also kind of behavioural patterns, again quite in keeping with Jung's idea that archetypes are essentially behavioural, and various other features. When Assagioli was writing about it, he was mainly focusing on ideas around age-related subpersonalities. So there was a sort of a child version of each of us, a teenage version of each of us, an adult version of each of us, an elderly version, well, if you live long enough, of each of us. These sort of age-related identities that develop. And as you get older, you can contain all of them, including the ones that are no longer directly relevant to the point you're in at that stage of your life. He picked up on ideas from William James as well, the American psychologist, and wrote about this idea of social role related subpersonalities. So there's, if you're a husband or wife, there is a married subpersonality. If you are a parent, there is a parenting, mother-father subpersonality. If you're a doctor or a plumber or whatever you are, then there is a career-related subpersonality. So these things develop, and even when you're no longer necessarily actively engaged, after you've retired from the job, for example, you nonetheless retain the subpersonality within. So Rowan works with that idea, but expands it a bit more, and suggests that these subpersonalities are rather like archetypal forces, and not dissimilar to Rollo May's idea of the daimon. They become clusters of ideas, of emotions, of behavioural patterns that acquire a kind of life of their own. Where Rollo May is writing about daimons, he tends to focus on more negative manifestations, which I suppose is quite natural for a therapist to look at the negative. But Rowan is allowing for positive as well as for negative associations, and there is a degree of situational neutrality, where a quality or a trait, a behavioural pattern that might be very useful in one circumstance could become problematic in a different circumstance. So it is not in and of itself a negative thing, but if it's applied wrongly, applied inappropriately, then it can become negative and dysfunctional, particularly if somebody becomes very overly reliant on a particular subpersonality taking kind of dominance within them. Now, within the healthy functioning individual, there is a central coordinating force, which we might think of as very much akin to Jung's idea of the self, which knows that these various subpersonalities exist and makes conscious selection as to which one it will adopt in any given situation, which, if you think of it like facets of a ruby or an emerald or some other gemstone, which facet is turned towards the individual looking at it. That this person is approaching me in a professional capacity, therefore I'll put my professional hat on. Now, a few hours later, somebody else is approaching me in a friendship capacity, so I'll put my friendship hat on. And again, the dual turns and another facet is shown. That subpersonality takes on a role. Something that Rowan picks up on, which I find quite interesting, I've mentioned a couple of my own books, is this idea that these subpersonalities acquire their own texture, their own range. So sometimes there are certain forms of clothing associated, so particularly a professional. If you've got to dress in a certain way for work, you have to put on a uniform or protective clothing or whatever, then that set of clothing, when you put it on, you put on the identity with the clothing. Or if we're going back to Sagioli's age-related things, if you had to wear a school uniform when you were a child, if you can still fit in your school uniform, you put it on, and part of your personality that maybe hasn't been active for years and years and years resurfaces, and that childlike version of you comes back to the fore. So there can be a clothing-related element to this. There is often a language set. So again, the way you talk in your professional role, you might use certain jargon, terminology that's highly unlikely to be used in any other situation, but it becomes the language of the professional subpersonality. And if you are father or mother to a very small child, you engage in all the kind of baby talk with them, so that becomes the language of that subpersonality. If you have a wild sex life and you're with your lover, all the romantic things that you say to your partner become part of the language of that personality, and you wouldn't necessarily use that language in any other context. So not only is there sometimes a dress, a kind of set of clothing to put on, but there are language subsets that go with each sub-personality, and certain topics that you talk about when you're in that sub-personality that you might not talk about under any other situation. And sometimes there is a name. Now it could be that when you're at work you are Mr. Jones, and when you meet up with your friends down the pub you are Tim, and when you go and visit your very elderly grandparents you're Timothy. And so you've got they're all interrelated names for you, but a version of that name is associated with each subpersonality. The formal, the informal, the nicknames. Maybe if you're hanging out with a rugby club or whatever it is you're hanging out with, that you have different names and identities associated with each one, and obviously in some religious orders, quite often in paganism, but also monastic orders and things like that, somebody becomes a monk or a nun, or they take up some other kind of a religious role, and often they'll assume a new name. So they'll become Sister Bridget or Brother John, or whoever they're going to become. It will be the new name, the new identity comes with the taking on board of a religious subpersonality as the dominant one. So there's all sorts of situations in which you get the clothing and the language subsets and the topics of interest and the names. But in the healthy mind, I say, you have the coordinating central force of the self, which knows all of these versions of you exist and kind of glides smoothly between them all as the situation demands. But not everyone, obviously, is in a healthy state of mind. Some people are in a very fractured state of mind. And this subpersonality approach becomes particularly interesting in that it feeds into things like what used to be called multiple personality disorder. It tends to be referred to as dissociative identity disorder these days, DID. Basically the same thing. Where for some people often associated with very deep, very horrendous traumatic events that have happened to them and left these very deep emotional scars. Not always necessarily childhood abuse, but often horrific things that have happened to that person in childhood that have never been fully processed or dealt with. And the individual develops extreme coping mechanisms to deal with the horrendous things that have happened to them. And sometimes that leads to a sharding off of personalities. So there is a subpersonality that's very protective, for example, and another one that's very, very vulnerable, one that's very innocent and naive, and maybe one that's quite violent and aggressive, and all sorts of subpersonalities shard off. But a key element here when it becomes pathological is that in certain very rare cases you have an individual who doesn't appear to have that central coordinating self that turns these subpersonalities on and off. Rather, sometimes one of the subpersonalities will kick in and the person will behave in a remarkably different way and seem to be unaware of the other subpersonalities for minutes, hours, possibly days, and then flip back into a different subpersonality and have no memory of what's happened during the period of time when the previous subpersonality was in charge. So it becomes a fugue state. And there have been some very well documented cases, some of them connected to criminal trials, of individuals who have done all sorts of things in a fugue state when one of these other subpersonalities has taken over, and the primary personality has no conscious, at least, memory of what has gone on. And it leads to all sorts of heated debates, obviously. Is this somebody just faking it because they've committed a crime and they're trying to get off the hook? Is it a very genuine fugue, blanking out of what's going on? Or does the person subconsciously know exactly what's going on? They're just kind of splitting themselves into different states to cope with a potentially challenging or traumatic situation that has occurred in their life. There's all sorts of heated discussions that are very difficult to prove one way or the other, because it's a very rare situation to find. But there's all sorts of circumstances, some of them sliding into the strange and the humorous, of people who move into different personalities and sometimes they become dominant, including some quite interesting ones. I'm a great admirer of the actor Jeremy Brett, who was very heavily associated with the role of Sherlock Holmes, going back quite a few decades now. His wife died, and he was very devoted to his wife, and it left him in a very, very vulnerable emotional state, and he started to experience psychiatric issues, spent some time in a hospital, and part of the issues he was struggling with as a method actor who subsumed himself into the role of Sherlock Holmes and whatever other roles he played in other films and TV shows and what have you, he really kind of got into the role, and for most of his life he was able to turn up at work, put on his costume, subsume into the role, perform the part, then take the costume off, go home and readjust it to normality. But in the aftermath of his wife's death, he got so kind of overwhelmed by the presence of Sherlock Holmes, by this role he was playing, that he started to struggle to turn it off and to remember who he actually was the rest of the time. He did eventually. He got therapy, got help, he came to terms with the situation. But that's an example of a kind of consciously created role, because the Sherlock Holmes, before he got the job, I don't suppose he was remotely Sherlock Holmes-like. He was, his own person. But he spent many years playing the part of Sherlock Holmes, and did it so remarkably well that people started to kind of view him as if he were Sherlock Holmes. And then he started to view himself in that way. So some of these sub-personalities may be just develop in response to life situations. Others are intentionally created by us because we want to be that sort of person. Either we're actors, or we've got some other kind of career where we have to put on a certain role, a certain face when we're at work, so we make a lot of effort to create the appropriate professional face, and it becomes a very intentional process. And that does overlap with some interesting elements within ritualistic magic of created identities and the formation of what's sometimes referred to as egregore, although those are usually collective efforts rather than individual things created by just one person. But this idea of shaping a sense of self, or a sub-sense of self, a sub-personality. So essentially what Rowan is describing is that the case of the person with DID, or multiple personality disorder, whatever you prefer to call it, is a very extreme version of something that's actually perfectly normal. The key difference is not the existence of all these multiple personalities. The key difference is that for the healthy person, there is a central coordinating force in charge of these different identities, rather like having a wardrobe of costumes and you just decide, right, I'm going to put this costume on now and be this person. And then, like Mr. Ben, for anyone overseas, that's an old cartoon that was popular for children in Britain many long years ago. You'd go into the wardrobe and you'd put on a different costume and you'd come out as somebody else, and you'd be in and out, being different people. But in the damaged person, the pathological person, there are these fugue states that emerge where one personality appears not to know that certain other personalities exist, or appears to not realise that they are actually all part and parcel of the same being, treating them as if they were completely different, separate, outside people, rather than different facets of the self, which is, as I say, rare and quite extreme, but it gives an interesting insight into ways in which the mind works. Assagioli and also later Rowan himself suggested that where it's becoming a bit pathological, not necessarily to the extreme of fugue states, but simply that people sometimes find themselves slipping into a role that they don't want to slip into, but they kind of, it happens without their conscious thought, and then it's very difficult to get out of. So if you're in an abusive relationship, then you might find yourself, as if you're the victim of the abusive relationship, slipping into a kind of victim mentality, when what you would like to do is stand up against the person who's abusing you, but it's so hard to resist doing it, particularly if you've fallen back into that victim state for a long period of time, and you're now trying to break the pattern of it. It can be very hard to break that pattern. In a similar way, you could say that addictions and dependencies often involve trying to become a different person and not fall back into being the addicted personality, the alcoholic, the heroin addict, the cocaine addict, or whatever. Well, you can really get addicted as such to cocaine unless you're super duper rich. but the heavy duty user. Um, that becomes a kind of a cluster personality in and of itself, the addict, and it's quite dominant, quite forceful, and it's almost like the person's at war with themselves. One bit of them doesn't want the other bit to take charge, but the other bit keeps taking charge. And it's not a fugue state, it's just this subpersonality that has an almost a life of its own. It becomes this kind of golem type thing that is created and takes on its own semi-autonomous state. And that obviously is somewhat more common than the person who goes into the fugue state. I think probably quite a lot of people will be able to identify with periods in their life when they've found themselves falling into a pattern of behaviour that consciously they don't want to do. But it's such a force of habit that they just sort of do it, and then afterwards think, oh, why did I do that? But it's done. But it's almost as if that again that subpersonality has its own kind of lived presence that wants to take charge at certain points in time. An element of this comes into Rowan's discussion of male psychological states. He wrote a book on the horned god. He was a Wiccan, and he talks about the idea of the goddess and the horned god, and that the goddess is the sort of embodied presence within women, and the horned god the embodied presence within men. That there are pathological, unhealthy ways to be a man, and there are better, healthier ways to be a man to establish healthier male personalities. And I'm sure he would have said the same about women as well, of healthy and unhealthy ways. And that trying to break the stranglehold of an unhealthy way to bring in a new, healthier way is quite an effort. It is not a straightforward, easy thing to do, but it can be done with effort and intent. And part of the intent, if you're kind of reflecting back on unhealthy patterns, which could be unhealthy for you, but also potentially unhealthy for other people. And in his Horned God book, he talks about, kind of reflects on his own life and situations when he's realised that he was being very sexist, very kind of condescending towards his wife, and only afterwards realised he was treating her in an inappropriate sort of a way, and that he was trying to break the pattern, making a conscious effort to break the pattern of this unsuitable way of behaving, but that he kept kind of falling back into routines and finding it difficult to break. That both he and Asagi recommended humour, which is also something that Viktor Frankl recommends in a slightly different context, as a therapeutic tool. That, having said about these subpersonalities having names, Mr. Jones and Tim and Timothy and so on, he says that if a subpersonality is difficult to deal with, then one way of moving the process forward is to consciously give it an amusing name, a sarcastic sort of a name, even if it's referred to as something like, the rude one, or the awkward one, or the greedy one, or whatever, to call it something a little bit funny, because that element of humour starts to create a psychological distance from the identity itself, and moves it into a position where it becomes a little bit easier to be in charge of and take control of, rather than being subservient to it and overly empowering it with too much force in its own right. So for him, the move for men must be towards a male psyche, and this is one of the areas where he has a little bit of a disagreement with Robert Bly and the whole Iron John thing, in that for Rowan, and this may reflect his Wiccan beliefs, key to a healthy male psyche is having a positive, healthy relationship with women, both the actual women in a man's life, girlfriend, sister, mother, next door neighbour, whoever, but also the inner feminine. So that Jungian notion of the anima within. Whereas he felt that Robert Bly didn't give much of any thought to the relationship between the male psyche and the female presence, either as actual human women or as the internalized feminine. So he's suggesting that there has to be balance, and what he's looking towards is not the dominating approach of patriarchy, of lording it over women, but rather a collaborative approach of working with flesh and blood human women, but also working with the feminine within the anima, within the man's own psyche. And he says, giving the although he's in one instance he's writing against the idea of hierarchies and seeing them as unhealthy. In another instance, he says that there is a kind of a deference to the goddess, to the feminine, as central, and that the horned god, the masculine, is more not peripheral, but at a somewhat removed from the centre. So the male exists in relation to its service to the feminine, rather than being central. It is the feminine that is central. Which obviously not everyone's going to agree with that, but that's his approach, his idea. Maybe that's something that could spark a bit of discussion within the Jungian circle as to how people view the male-female relationships there, and whether that would apply to absolutely everyone or only to certain people, and all that kind of debate to go on. He talks about various different levels of consciousness, including terms like the centaur consciousness, which is a kind of an integrated approach, and it involves, very similar to Jung's idea of actualization, puts a lot of emphasis on personal responsibility and personal growth, and taking responsibility for your own actions. In one interview he talks about having had several, I can't remember the exact number, it might have been 5 or 6, something like that, several of these actualization moments in his life, rather than having one single one, which is in keeping with Jung's idea, because Jung says you don't kind of just actualize and then that's it, that's you done, you just go and walk on your own bath water and float up to heaven. Rather, he says you achieve actualization and you go on living, you go on being you, rather like that Buddhist idea of the bodhisattva who goes on trying to help other people rather than transcending upwards. And that sometimes, having attained actualization, people fall away from it. They get too egotistical, too up themselves, and kind of feeling that themselves to be the great wizard, the great witch, whatever, the great, profound spiritual what's it, and they become a bit delusional as a result, and then they've got to re-begin the whole process of trying to integrate the shadow and the anima and the animus and the inner child and the inner sage, and go through all of those stages again to achieve actualization a second or a third or a fourth time. So it's not a one-off thing. So what Rowan is describing in terms of his own life experience is quite within keeping with what Jung himself was describing on that front. He uses in at least one of his books, possibly so, I've not read them all, so he may have used it in more than one book, but in at least one book he uses alchemical terminology and language, things like the Negredo and the Trinitas and the Albedo and so on, for different stages, different aspects of the journey for men as they confront their own shadow side and the harms that they have done to other people, but also he talks about the harms done to them. And one of the harms, although I'm not sure you could really say it's done to them, not in terms of the way he describes it at any rate, but he talks about having conversations with various feminists in his circle, and some of the women pointing out things that either he personally or men in a much more generic sense have done that damages women, and that his own coming to terms with that was itself quite painful, realising that he'd done things to the women in his lives unintentionally. He had upheld a system that was harmful, again he says unintentionally, and so kind of taking responsibility. And I can kind of see it again coming back to the addiction model. It's a similar thing within things like AA and NA, where part of the process is people saying, well, I've nicked my granny's purse to feed my drug habit, and I've done this, and I've done that, and I've done the other, and thinking about the harms they have caused, not only to themselves, in terms of health damage and things like that, but also the harms they've done to the people around them whilst in the throes of an addiction. That is obviously a very painful thing to realise if you're in a better state of mind than the one you were in at the time you did the horrible behaviour, and you're looking back on that behaviour, getting drunk and beating somebody up, or stealing money to feed a habit, or not paying the rent, or not buying food for your kids and leaving them to go hungry because you spent all the money on your substance, that kind of thing. Realising when you're in a better state of mind to think about these things more clearly, realising what you've done and how hurtful that has been to other people must be quite a shock for people to come to terms with, and they must feel quite their self-esteem, I suppose, is a bit shattered, as they think, God, what an absolute tosspot I've been when I did such and such a thing. And that's kind of what Rowan is talking about when he's having these conversations, or had, past tense, these conversations with the various feminists he was talking to, that they would say, well, you did this, or men did that, and then he'd go away and think about it and think, oh God, maybe I have done some really unpleasant things, or rude things, or disempowering things, or whatever, and then have to come to terms with it. And it was a painful thing to come to terms with, and that pain, whilst he's not saying you should avoid it or run away from it, he's saying you do have to acknowledge it and achieve a form of healing with it, rather than pretend it's not there, or go into denial, or get all angry and reject the idea that, oh, I've never done this, I've never done that. To say, well, actually, yes, I have, and it has to be processed. So part of, when he's talking about healing the wounded psyche, part of it is other things that have caused wounds and damage, but also a recognition of your own destructive impact, rather, not input, impact, no matter how possibly unintentional that impact may have been at the time, perhaps, and realising that you've caused harm, caused damage, and going beyond that, and kind of healing that sense of shock that perhaps, I think it is shock he's describing, because often he is suggesting that people do things without even realising they're doing them half the time. Some of it will be, of course, very deliberate, very intentional, but other occasions he says that there's far more unintentional harms caused than there are deliberate intentional harms caused, but both have to be dealt with and processed and moved beyond. But I think I've rambled on enough for this one. We can perhaps look at the alchemical stages in a bit more detail in the discussion group and explore those ideas, and run with them. But I'll leave it there for now. And if anyone's got any comments, do just leave them in the message section. And if you would like the link for taking part in the discussion, do shout, and I'll send it across to you. Thank you.